Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. This is the ECOMFIN webinar series, and I am Andrea Roncoroni, Director of the ECOMFIN Research Center at ESSEC Business School. Today we have the pleasure to have Professor Shi Chen with us. She is an Associate Professor of Operations Management at the Michael G. Foster School of Business at the University of Washington in Seattle, US. He earned his PhD in Management Science and Engineering from Stanford, US, and an MS and a bachelor degree in Industrial Engineering from Tsinghua in Beijing, China. His research focuses on supply chain management, pricing and revenue management, sustainable operations, and business analytics. His scholarly work has appeared in top-tier journals, including Management Science, Manufacturing and Service Operations Management, and Production and Operations Management. He integrates economic modeling with data analytics to investigate how firms can improve operational efficiency and sustainability. His recent publications project examine the impact of product durability and carbon emission regulation on firms' pricing and sourcing decisions. Today, he is presenting his latest research work on collective power purchase agreement, negotiation, and risk-sharing mechanism. Thank you for joining us, Shi, and thanks for being with us, and the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Andrea, for inviting me to give this talk at your webinar series, and thank you for all the audience. It's my great honor to present this work. As Andrea just introduced, I'm going to talk about Collective Power Purchase Agreement, the PPA, and we are going to focus on negotiation and risk-sharing mechanisms. So this work is it's a joint work with my PhD student, Xiaoxuan Hou, who is a PhD student in my department in University of Washington, and also my co-author, Cameron Moinzadeh, who is a full professor in our department. So here is the outline of today's talk. I'm going to first talk about some background stories, and then we are going to propose our research questions. We are going to focus on the main model, the base model development, and we are going to show some results. And finally, if the time allows, I'm going to quickly go through some extensions, and I will also conclude this talk with some takeaways from this research. So let's take a look at the background. So what makes us most interested in this research is the commitment to 100% renewable energy in the recent years. You can see from this graph. So this shows an organization called RE100. So this is a global initiative, including many big companies. There are almost like 400 companies, big companies, small companies, across more than 150 different markets, across the different sectors, including the top 3 most electricity consuming industries, including service, manufacturing, and retailing. As you can see, this initiative started around 2014, 2015, with the initial members including IKEA, Google, and Microsoft, right? So for example, Google joined the initiative in 2015, and the company actually announced that it achieved this goal of sourcing 100% renewable energy by the end of 2020. So something like that. Okay, so in the next slides, I want to quickly show you the electricity and geography footprint of the RE100 members, right? You can see that there are a lot of presence of the companies of the RE100 in the North America, especially the US, and also in West Europe, and some companies in Japan, Korea, and China, right? And we also know that some interesting facts that there are top 5 markets for renewable energy. In North America is US, and in Europe, I think it's UK, Germany, and Spain. And in the Asian Pacific area, I think it's China. And this graph also shows some so-called most challenging markets, including, you can see Russia is one of the most challenging countries in terms of sourcing renewable energy, and also Japan, Korea, and here Singapore, and Argentina in South America. So those countries face lots of barriers The barriers could be limited supply of renewable energy or limited capacity or maybe some government or regulation barriers and so on. Okay, so these two slides to just to give you some general idea of the renewable energy purchase and procurement. And we see that a lot of companies, they put a lot of investment and a lot of emphasis on purchasing 100% renewable energy. Okay, so in terms of the purchase of the renewable energy, there are three different ways. There are some typical ways of doing so. So let me go through the three common ways of purchasing renewable energy. There's first way, most straightforward way is to self-own renewable energy assets, right? So this means the company can have the financial and the physical ownership of some wind farms or solar farms and so on. So of course, this adds new renewable capacity to the system, right? You can imagine that a big company like a Google or Microsoft or Meta or Facebook, previously called Facebook, they have their own data centers. They consume lots of energy, and in order to keep their commitment to meet 100% of renewable energy, then they're going to build some wind farms or own some wind farms and solar farms in order to meet their target. However, you can imagine that not every company has the capability and the financial resource to own such big renewable energy assets, right? Not every company is allowed, like Google or Microsoft, especially for many small and medium-sized companies. They have to pursue other avenues. So this gives a second avenue, which is the purchase of the so-called green electricity certificates. Well, in the US, it's called RECs, right? The renewable energy certificates, or in Europe, it's known as the guarantees of the origins. So those are green energy certificates, and every company, every business, they can go to the green energy certificate markets and purchase or even sell their existing certificates. So for example, in the US, there is a market of the RECs, of the RECs. Yet, many people argue that this enables many companies to just meet their renewable energy consumption goals by purchasing the green energy certificates provided by some other companies. This doesn't really add a new renewable capability to the grid. So this is something that many people have been arguing about. So finally, we have the focus of this study, which is so-called corporate PPA, the Corporate Power Purchase Agreement, which can be kind of regarded as in between of the two things. For many small companies, you don't need to necessarily develop and own your renewable energy asset, but you can actually provide financial support to the developers of the renewable energy asset through certain financial agreement. And typically a corporate PPA is a long-term supply chain contract of renewable energy with certain risk sharing mechanisms. The advantage of corporate PPA is that it does help the society to add more and new renewable capacity to the system, right? And here I'd like to give you more examples. There are several examples. And the first example is from Europe, the so-called Dutch Wind Consortium. This is a very famous example of what we call collective PPA contracts. It means that several firms, several companies, they can form a buying firm coalition, and together they can negotiate a good deal with the developer of the renewable energy. So in this case, the Dutch Wind Consortium, there are four companies, if I remember correctly, including Google and Philips. They jointly formed this wind consortium in order to finance and support the development of wind farms in Netherlands. Another example from Europe is there are more than 20 British universities. They just signed a deal in order to buy energy, clean energy, directly from the wind farms. And usually the wind farms in UK are located in Scotland and Wales. Another example is from Australia. So here, as you can see from the headline, there are many Western Australian councils, city councils. I remember there are more than 50 Western Australian local government. They form a coalition and they try to purchase renewable energy together. It has a potential to be the largest such project in Australia once this project is done. Finally, back in the US, we have seen many examples as well. So here I have one ceiling example based on 5 Walmart suppliers, including some famous suppliers like Amy's Kitchen or Good Lake Cheese, Smuckers, and so on. So those big suppliers of Walmart, they also team up together and they try to purchase renewable energy and enter a 12-year power purchase agreement with the developers of the renewable projects. So based on all these examples, we propose the research questions as follows. So we have 3 main research questions. In the first research question, we try to understand how can multiple buyers, especially small and medium-sized buyers, not like a Google or Microsoft, right? Small local businesses, if you want to commit to renewable energy purchase, then how can you negotiate with the seller within the PPA framework? And in this research, we classify the negotiation mechanism into 3 categories. We call them separate negotiation, agent-based negotiation, and consortium-based or joint negotiation. The second question is we want to understand how different negotiation mechanisms perform differently in the following dimensions. In the first dimension, we care about the renewable project size, right? Because we want to get more financial support in order to develop more and more renewable energy project. Secondly, we also want to investigate how the profit will be split between the different buyers and different sellers. And finally, we want to understand the buyer's preferences across different negotiation mechanisms, right? Do the buyers like the agent-based negotiation or do the buyers like the joint negotiation more? Finally, we also want to understand how firms' operational strategies influence the negotiation outcomes. In particular, in the model extension I'm going to mention later on, we are going to consider 2 operational strategies. The first operational strategy is about the banking and the trading strategy of renewable energy certificates. This is because once you support a renewable energy project, and you actually can obtain some renewable energy certificates. In some period, you may want to bank your RECs in anticipation of future use of these certificates, but sometimes you just want to sell them into the REC markets in order to earn some profit or revenue from this selling. And the second extension we want to consider in this talk is the buyer's risk-averse attitudes. Keep in mind that most of the buyers are small and medium size of companies, and it's natural to assume that they have some risk-averse attitudes. Okay. Having proposed the 3 major research questions, we have also done a comprehensive literature review to better position our research. And of course, first of all, this research is positioned in the broad area of socially responsible and environmentally sustainable supply chain management. And the audience can see there are 2 excellent survey papers of this area. And of course, there are more survey papers given the increasing attention and interest in this very important and timely topic. Secondly, in terms of renewable energy procurements, we identified that there are 2 major categories of the research. The first category of research focuses the problem from the policymaker or market designer's perspective. But the second stream, they focus more on utility company or individual consumer buyers' perspective. And we found that in the literature, interestingly, that there are very few studies explore how corporate buyers they can source renewable energy through certain financial or supply contracts. And even though there are a few studies that do focus on the actions or strategies of the corporate buyers, there's very little study, little literature has focused on the collective efforts of these corporate buyers. So that gives us the position of this research. We try to investigate and understand the different perspective from the corporate buyers, especially from their collective actions perspective. So now I'm going to move forward to talk more about the model setup. So first of all, let's talk about how does a PPA work in general. Generally speaking, PPA is a long-term supply contract. It's a long-term contract of renewable energy with a fixed price structure. You may take a look at the graph on the right-hand side. So we have a corporate buyers. So we have some corporate buyers. And the corporate buyers, maybe this is a tenant of the commercial building, you have your demand of electricity, right? So then you have to pay a bill to the local utility. So this is a utility payments. And in return, you get power, you get electricity from the grid, from the electricity markets. On the other hand, suppose that this corporate buyer, this firm also wants to support some development project of renewable energy project. So here we call them the renewable energy project developers. So notice that the developers or the project and the corporate buyers, they are not necessarily in the same location. So maybe the corporate buyer is in Seattle, right? But the developer is in Arizona. So in this case, the PPA actually specify a fixed price. So in this example, we can see that is a $30 per megawatt hours. So this is the long-term fixed price that this corporate buyer will pay this developer. You always pay this price. So not surprisingly, this also becomes the revenue that the renewable project developer will receive. So it's always $30 per megawatt hours. And the renewable project developer, after receiving this fund, will develop this project and it will actually generate some renewable energy, and this will go into the electricity market. But notice that the electricity price could be different. It could be a random variable. So in case one, right? In this case, suppose the market price turns out to be high. In this case, it's $35 per megawatt hours. So the renewable project developer will actually pass this market price and return it to the corporate buyer. So this $35 per megawatt hours becomes the revenue for this corporate buyer. On the other hand, remember that the corporate buyer has paid $30 to the developer. So in this case, the net profit for this buyer is $5 per megawatt hours. So this is just one of the scenarios. So this is a good scenario when market price is high. But sometimes the market price could be low. That is a bad scenario. We call that case two. So for example, if in case two, the market price is only $25 per megawatt hours. So it means that what the corporate buyer received from the market is only $25, but the corporate buyer has paid $30. So in this case, there is a negative net profit, which is a loss of $5 per megawatt hours. So in this case, you'll see that the corporate buyer actually bears all the risks coming from the volatile market price. But the renewable energy project developer receive a constant cash flow from the corporate buyer. So this gives the developer some incentive to implement this project, to develop this renewable energy project. So this is how, generally speaking, how a PPA works. All right, so based on this motivation, let's consider what happens if we have a multiple buyers, right? So to illustrate the idea, we consider, let's say, two buyers, buyer one and buyer two. The two buyers may have a different cost structure, different negotiation powers against each other, right? So later on, we're going to elaborate on this dynamics. But generally speaking, we have three models. We have the baseline case, we call that separate negotiation. We also have agent-based and joint negotiation. In a separate negotiation, each buyer will enter a negotiation with the seller independently. In each negotiation, so for example, between the negotiation between buyer one and the seller, then these two parties will determine the contract price, which is called V1, and also the purchase quantity, which we call that Q1. Similarly, buyer two can negotiate with the seller with the contract price V2 and the quantity to purchase Q2. So from the seller's perspective, the total quantity Q is equal to Q1 plus Q2. Right? So this is the baseline case because the two buyers, they don't coordinate with each other. They just enter the negotiation with the seller separately. But we may have some collective mechanism design. In this case, agent-based negotiation, we call buyer one is an agent and the buyer two is a follower. And the negotiation has two steps or two stages. In the first step, buyer one and buyer two, they will enter an internal negotiation, right? So for example, buyer one would say, okay, V2 is the price I'm going to pay you, buyer two, and the Q2 is an order quantity from buyer 2. And notice that this means that in the first step, buyer 1 has to pre-commit to the price and the quantity with buyer 2. With that information, buyer 1 will then enter the next negotiation with the seller. We call that external negotiation. Facing the seller, the buyer will negotiate a contract price V1 and also the total quantity Q1 plus Q2. So this is called agent-based negotiation. You can imagine that in practice, sometimes there are one or more smaller buyers. They want to tag along with some experienced buyer. So the experienced buyer is usually the agent, and the many other buyers, we call them the followers. In contrast, we may have something different, the so-called joint negotiation. In the joint negotiation, buyer I and buyer J, maybe buyer 1 and buyer 2, they are more equal in this negotiation. There's no leader, there's no followers. So the only thing they need to determine in the first step is how they want to share the percentage. Each one will determine the percentage of the share of the total quantity. So for example, buyer 1 may say, I want to take 60% of the project output, and the buyer 2 then say, okay, I will take the rest, which is a 40% of the project output. And then the two buyers, they form a coalition, and together they will negotiate with the seller, right? They will determine a unified price V and a unified total quantity Q. So in contrast to the agent-based negotiation, you can see that in agent-based negotiation, there is a negotiation agent. So buyer 1 plays a key role in this two-step negotiation. But in joint negotiation, all the buyers are kind of like partners, and together they will negotiate with the seller. So then in the next presentation, I'm going to focus on one example because we can formulate mathematically the optimization problems for different buyers and sellers in different mechanisms. But for the sake of the time, I'm going to focus on the agent-based negotiation as one example. To tell you the things, so those are the input of the model. There are many things, but let me quickly go through the most important things. For every buyer in this game, so they will face random price of the renewable electricity in the future, right? Keep in mind that this is a long-term contract, so nobody has a perfect forecast. But every buyer, they should have a forecast of future renewable energy price. They also have a forecast of the future price of the RECs. And everybody, they will have a discount factor denoted by the gamma. And both buyers, they will have their own demand, right? So the demand means how much electricity they're going to consume in every year. And they also have the local electricity cost, because remember that in the two slides ahead of these slides, I have mentioned that all the buyers, they have their local demand, they have to pay their local utility. So the C's represent the local cost of paying the local utility. In this research, we also assume that each buyer, they have their own renewable targets. So for example, in reality, the company may say, hey, I want next year, I want 50% of my electricity consumptions will come from renewable energy. Or maybe after 5 years from now on, we hope that we will achieve 100% renewable energy target and so on. And usually the renewable energy targets are given exhaustively because based on the policy requirement, based on regulation and government policy and so on. We also assume that there is an upfront cost, which is convex and increasing, which depends on the project size. And we also consider that there is a fixed contract length, which is denoted as T, and there are also a project's useful lifetime, and which is L. And typically the contract length is about 8 to 10 years, sometimes could be longer, but the project's useful lifetime could be even longer than that. So based on that, we can formulate the buyer one's payoff with and without PPA. So let's look at this term. This term represents this is the condition, this is a situation if a buyer one doesn't sign any PPA. Then in this case, the buyer will incur the local utility cost because C is how much you pay the local utility and the D is your demand, right? And the second term represents how much money you pay at the REC market, because remember that if you don't generate any renewable energy, then you have to meet your renewable energy target simply by going to the REC market and purchase the REC certificate, right? So the REC certificates are generated by some renewable energy developers, and you just go to the market and purchase at the price, which is called R1T, right? So it means that in this case, you don't have profit or revenue from the PPA because you don't sign the PPA, and you have the demand cost, you have the cost to satisfying your own demand, and you have the cost to meet the renewable target. In contrast, if you have signed a contract, the PPA contract, then you may get some actually the profit from the contract. So in the first term, that is how much profit you can earn through the PPA contract between this buyer, let's say buyer one, and the seller. And the second term could be the profit, or sometimes it could be a loss if it's a negative, coming from the contract between buyer one and the buyer two. And the next term is also about the profit or the cost of if you sell. So for example, if you sell your REC into the market, then you earn a profit. But if you need to purchase the REC from the market, then you have a cost, right? So for example, if your renewable energy quantity is Q1, well, your target is G1T. So you have a target. So if your production or generation of your renewable energy is higher than your target, then it means that you have some excess RECs, which you can sell to the market, and that becomes your profit. In contrast, if your renewable energy generation is lower than your renewable targets, it means that you have to go to the market, you need to go to the REC market and purchase at the REC market price, which becomes a negative term, which represents a cost. And finally, you still have this cost term to represent how much money you have to pay the local utility. Okay, so in short, it means that the buyer's payoff with the PPA coming from your profit and revenue through the PPA contracts, plus any profit or minus any cost from meeting the renewable targets, and minus your local demand and your local utility bills. So the buyer's profit gain is the difference between your profit with and without PPA, which we call that delta. So we focus on this delta because it represents the benefits of signing a PPA contract for this company. Well, there are still more notations, but I don't think I need to go through all the details. If you have questions, we can always answer the questions offline. But basically, it means that the delta 1 can be reduced in a more compact form. And in the next slides, it gives even more details about this formulation. But the high-level takeaway is that we have a two-stage Nash bargaining negotiation problem, right? So first of all, the buyer and the buyer two, between the two buyers, they need to negotiate to determine the optimal contract terms of V2 and Q2 by maximize this Nash bargaining product. So this Nash bargaining product is a weighted multiplication of delta 1, which is the benefit of buyer 1 if this buyer enters into this contract, and the delta 2, which is the benefit for buyer 2 if buyer 2 also agrees to enter into this contract. So here we have some weights alpha 1, 2, and 1 minus alpha 1, 2. This, by the definition, defines the buyer's relative bargaining power against each other. So for example, alpha 1, 2 is a parameter between 0 and 1, representing how powerful that buyer 1 is relative to buyer 2. So 1 minus alpha 1, 2, of course, by the definition, measures the bargaining power of buyer 2 vis-a-vis buyer 1. So that is a stage 1 problem. After having solved this problem, we are going back to buyer 1, the seller's problem. According to this graph, you can see that in this stage, the decision variables are V1, that is a contract term between buyer 1 and the seller, and also Q1, which is a quantity of buyer 1 himself or herself. In this case, again, we want to maximize the Nash bargaining products by considering the benefit of buyer 1 and also the benefits of the seller. So this is just follow the standard Nash bargaining framework. After analyzing this problem, we have some theorems, and later on I'm going to dive into more details to show you more insights. So this is the first result. So this is theorem 1. Theorem 1 says that, okay, for this very simple model, suppose we have all risk neutral buyers, and we consider different negotiation mechanisms, but we found that actually different mechanisms will result in the same quantity in equilibrium. So S represents separate, and A represents agent-based, and J means joint. You can see that according to this theorem, all three mechanisms lead to the same optimal quantity Q star, which satisfies a simple equation, and it can be explained as follows. On the left-hand side, which is a marginal cost at the optimal product Q star. And on the right-hand side, we have the summation of the 2 points. In the first part, we have the marginal revenue during the contract period. And the second term represents the marginal revenue beyond the contract terms, because we have assumed that the life cycle of the projects is typically longer than the duration of the project. So this is the first theorem. But more interestingly, we also want to investigate the different buyers, and different parties, including the seller, their different preferences across negotiation mechanism. And we have this result. Let me explain the meaning of this result, the key takeaway from this result. First, if you take a look at this part, it means that for the buyers, the joint negotiation is always better than separate negotiation. This is not a terribly surprising result. It means that collaboration between the buyers will always benefit them. Well, of course, the seller will always prefer separate negotiation. That's also not very surprising, right? Yet, we also found that it's interesting that it's difficult for buyer to agree on the same collaboration mechanism. If you take a look at this part, this notation means that this is the benefit of a buyer if the buyer acts as a follower in the agent-based negotiation mechanism. And this term means that this is the benefit for the buyer if this buyer acts as agent. So what does it mean? It means that, well, every buyer wants to be an agent, wants to have an agent because you want to be the follower, right? But no one really wants to be the agent because being the agent has some cost. So this is interesting, a little bit counterintuitive. So the reason is that in this case, in the agent-based mechanism, we believe there is a commitment effect, right? Because if you really think about the sequence of events, in the first stage, the two buyers, the agent and the follower, they have to negotiate, and the agent has to pre-commit to the quantity and the price with the buyer. So it means that the agent has a pre-commitment problem, while the follower has some advantage because the follower can first lock in a favorable price and project size during the internal negotiation with the agent without worrying about later on negotiation with the seller. So in this case, the follower has some advantage. Maybe that's the reason why we found that every buyer wants to have an agent, but no one really wants to be the agent. Furthermore, we also investigate the buyer correlations preference. It means that, okay, if we care about the total profit of the two buyers as a correlation, then we found some interesting results as well. So in short, it means that this preference depends on the relative negotiation power. And let's see the next slides. Here we have a corollary. And this corollary also represents some relatively counterintuitive result. So let's take a look at the first result. It says that for agent-based negotiation, who should be the agent? Suppose that we have two different buyers, and one buyer has a larger negotiation power, but the other one has a smaller negotiation power. Maybe the intuition says that, well, we should always put the stronger buyer as the agent because if the buyer is stronger, it means that it has more negotiation power against the seller. But our findings indicate the opposite. We found that it is always beneficial to put a weaker buyer acts as the agent. Well, this is a very interesting result, and this motivates us to think more why we got this result. Is there anything wrong with the model, or is there something that we can observe? And here is our intuition. The intuition is that in the agent-based negotiation, as I mentioned in the last slides, there is a commitment effect. It means that if we put a weaker agent as the negotiation agent, right? So in the second stage negotiation, vis-a-vis the seller, the agent cannot easily sacrifice the stronger follower's terms to secure a better deal, right? In contrast, imagine what would happen if there is a stronger firm and we let stronger firm to be the agent. Well, it is true that a stronger firm has more negotiation power against the seller, but it can also leverage its negotiation power against the other weaker firm, which is a follower in the first stage of negotiation. This may end up compromising too much on the benefits of the weaker follower, leading to a less favorable coalition outcomes. So this is our explanation for these results. Secondly, furthermore, if we take a look at the preference for the coalition as a whole, if we consider that, okay, the total profit of the two buyers, and we found that in this region, you can see that on this region, agent-based negotiation is even better than joint negotiation. But in this region, the joint negotiation could be even better than agent-based. So again, this implies the following. We summarize the managerial insights as follows. We found that the joint negotiation is more favorable if the negotiation power between the two buyers is relatively more unequal. In contrast, we found that the agent-based negotiation performs better, especially when their negotiation power is relatively balanced. So our explanation is as follows. As the first point implies, if we want to put an agent, we want to put a weaker buyer to be the agent. So this explains why in agent-based negotiation, we desire them to have a relatively similar negotiation power. Because in this case, it doesn't really matter which buyer you want to put it as agent. Because in this case, the internal negotiation between the two buyers will be relatively equitable. But if we have a dominant buyer with many small buyers, we will advocate the joint negotiation. Because in this case, our result shows that in this case, if their negotiation power is relatively unequal, then joint negotiation will be to the best interest to the buyer negotiation. Okay. And then I think I still have a little bit time. I want to quickly give you some demonstration of what other things we have done in this research. We have considered various model extensions. The first major extension is REC banking. So it means that we want to add an operational phase, phase number 2, to the base model. In the base model, we don't have phase number 2. And in this operational phase, we assume that the buyers can strategically optimize their REC banking strategy. So what does it mean? Remember that in the base model, we assume every company, they have their own renewable target. And every period, they receive a certain quantity from the developer of the renewable energy, right? We assume that, okay, if the generation of the renewable energy is smaller than the target, right? This is the first case. If the energy generation is smaller than the target, then we assume that you have to go to the REC market and purchase the REC certificate in order to fill in the gap. There's no problem with that part. However, what happens if the generation of the renewable energy, QI, is even greater than your target? It means that now you have generated too much renewable energy. Then what you can do is you can sell the excess REC in the market. But in the base model, we assume that you'll always sell everything you have. There's no banking or no inventory of your REC certificate. Well, in this extension, we assume that, well, the company could do better by considering the possibility of banking some REC certificate and sell it in the later periods. So we can formulate this problem as a DP problem. And because of the banking of REC, we found that this is a kind of similar to an inventory problem. So for example, we can define I of t as an ending REC inventory in period t, right? In the base model, IT is always equal to 0 because we're going to sell any excess REC back into the REC market. But here, we make it as a decision variable. And in the formulation, it's a DP formulation. I don't want to go through all the details, but just notice that we have some highlighted part which are dependent on the inventory levels of the REC, right? So basically, the problem can be written as for the one period profit function is equal to something IMT, which is independent of your inventory decisions, plus a term that depends on the difference between your inventory of the previous period and your inventory of the current period. So we know how to solve this dynamic programming problem. It's a multi-period finite horizon dynamic programming problem. And fortunately, we can fully characterize the optimal policy. And we found that the optimal policy is a bound-bound strategy in this case. The bond strategy means that, okay, in this period, either you sell all available RECs or you bank all available RECs. So this is a bond strategy. And in the working paper, we can further characterize under which conditions you want to sell and under which conditions you want to bank. But just at a high level, I want to point out that those are some interesting extensions to the base model. Then what's the result, right? Importantly, we want to understand the first thing is whether the major insights we have obtained from the base model, they still hold. Second thing is we want to investigate whether we get some new insight coming from this model extension. So we still have two major performance measures. The first one is equilibrium project sizes. And one major result regarding this extension is that the option of REC banking can yield higher equilibrium project size. And I think the reason is that with the option of REC banking, the profitability of the both buyers will be increased. And because of that, the buyers can actually finance a larger size of the project because we'll have assumed that because of the upfront fee, there is an upfront cost, right? The larger the project size, then the higher the cost of the project. But because the profitability has been improved, then they can finance a higher equilibrium project size. Numerically, we still find that the three negotiation mechanisms, they all result in the same equilibrium project size. Later on, I will show that the next extension will cause this result to change. But at least under the current assumptions with risk neutral buyers, this is a very important assumption, then the three negotiation mechanism, they will result in the same project size. In terms of preference, we still observe the same pattern to that of the base model. So this is good news for us. It means that the base model actually generated some very robust managerial insights. Recall that we said that for agent-based negotiation, which is more favorable under the condition when the buyer's negotiation power is relatively more balanced. But in contrast, the joint negotiation is more favorable if the buyer's negotiation power is relatively unequal. So these insights still hold. And also we have another model extension, but because of the time limit, I just want to mention that the second extension focuses on risk-averse buyers. When the buyers are risk-averse, we modify the buyer's utility function or objective function. To this end, we follow a very common assumption in the literature by assuming that the buyer's utility function or objective function is a typical mean variance utility function. You see that the second term is basically there is a penalty to the variance of the outcome. So it means that the buyer not only cares about the expected profit, also it cares about the variance. So in this case, again, we can verify that most of our findings in the previous models still hold. And we also get some new insights. The first insight says that the risk aversion attitude will reduce the equilibrium project size across all mechanisms. Especially the joint negotiation is most adversely affected. It means that the joint negotiation is most sensitive to the risk aversion attitudes of the buyers. Well, in contrast, agent-based negotiation is the least affected. So we observe that consistently through our numerical studies to verify that those insights are robust. And of course, we have other model extensions.
Let me interrupt you. There are basically two questions.
Sure.
Metin is making a question in the chat. So can you read it, or do you want me to open the chat and read it? It say, is it conceivable that the agent buyer first negotiates with the buyer to secure terms and then negotiates with the follower buyer?
Okay, so I think the question is about what happens if for the agent-based negotiation if the sequence is opposite, right? So my understanding of this question is what happens if, for example, the agent first negotiate with the seller regarding a price and quantity, and going back, then the agent negotiated with the follower buyer. I have to say we haven't considered this possibility, but maybe a subtle question is, in this case, if agent doesn't know the quantity, that is the demand from the follower, then in the negotiation with the seller, how can this agent determine the order quantity, right? In contrast, I think our sequence is more natural. So first, the agent needs to negotiate or communicate with the follower, get some information about, okay, the price and the quantity that the follower is willing to pay, and then the agent will finalize the negotiation with the seller. So I think that's our my answer to this question. Yeah.
Okay. And the second question is a question I would like to make about this very slide. So
Mhm.
it's very intriguing, the last sentence where you say that the joint negotiation is most adversely affected
Yeah.
compared to the agent-based negotiation.
Yeah.
And I was wondering whether we can figure out an intuitive explanation, I would say economic explanation about this effect.
Yeah.
And
That's a. Mhm.
yeah, no, my question is, uh, have you tried to compare the the target, so the expected profit without variance, just the risk neutral expected profit
Mhm.
of the two cases, joint negotiation and agent-based negotiation?
Yeah.
And I assume that you made this comparison, but the question is, what about the variance? And here it says that because we have actually two effects, right? One effect
Yeah.
is that when you move from agent-based negotiation to joint negotiation, you have an effect on the expectation and an effect on the variance, right?
Mhm.
Now,
Mhm.
what you say here is when you say most adversely affected, do you mean that compared to the case with no variance, then you have a lower utility in the joint negotiation, or the variance itself of pi in the
Mhm.
case of joint negotiation is greater than agent-based negotiation, which does not really mean you're more affected, because then you have to look at the expectation. You see what I mean?
Yeah, I can see what you mean here. Yeah, very, very good suggestion, Andrea. So first of all, I have to acknowledge that we haven't investigated in details, right? Because after having switched to this mean variance utility function, we need, I think this is a great idea that we need to take a look at those two terms, the
Yep.
mean of the profit and also the variance of the profit. Uh, Take a look at them separately to see which term has a dominant effect in this final result, right? So
Yeah.
it's possible that from the buyer's perspective, okay, maybe under one mechanism, their utility is higher. But maybe it's the possible that their mean is even higher, but maybe their variance is also higher. So
Much
there
higher.
are
Yeah.
some counter force here, and that's an excellent suggestion. I think it will be very interesting to not only look at the final outcome regarding the utility function, but also the two terms separately.
Yeah, because
Uh,
I suspect that if you compare the optimal mean variance
yeah,
across a different level of the risk aversion coefficient rho,
yeah,
you might have an inversion of the last
mm,
property. So for certain level of rho, you might have joint negotiation has a higher utility than agent based, and for other value, it's vice versa. So it's expectation, it's variance, and it's also the risk aversion coefficient.
right,
So maybe it could be interesting to take a look at that.
exactly.
And yeah, and then another thing you might do is something that has been suggested by Liao, Liao Wang,
Hmm.
in her first paper
Yeah.
with David Yao, the
Hmm.
operations research paper in 2017, if I correctly remember. They
Hmm.
basically did something quite interesting. They plotted the efficient frontier, just like
Hmm.
people do in finance for portfolio management. But in
Right.
finance, actually, you plot the frontier
Hmm.
by ranging, let the vector of allocation range across all possible vector of allocations. And that's
Right.
quite, it lives in a space which you cannot make any visual representation, but you can visually
Uh-huh.
represent those two values, the expectation and the variance. In the case of operations, you can do this by modifying Q. So
Mm-hmm.
across different level of Q, you have an
Mm-hmm.
expectation and you have a variance. And then you
Right.
try to plot this. So this might help you at understanding what happens at different level of operational intensity to the
Mm-hmm.
expectation and the variance as well as their trade-off, and maybe sharpen your intuition for getting an interpretation of the last statement in this slide.
Well,
That's a suggestion.
that's a great suggestion. Thank you, Andrea, for that. And just on a final note, so this sentence that you're curious about is about the product size. It's not about the revenue. So I
Ah,
totally agree with you that
sorry. Okay.
yeah, I totally agree
Okay.
with you that if we want to understand the different risk averse attitude degree on how it
Okay.
impacts
Okay.
the profit and so on, yeah, we can. That's very
Okay, so
good.
I saw, I
Yeah,
saw, I saw.
yeah,
Okay, so project size. Okay, the
yeah.
project size, and then it would be nice to see if the project size is most adversely affected. What
Mhm.
about you? That's the point, because you might have a big affection of the project size, but then the U might be greater for some reason.
Mhm.
Why? Because imagine you have a lower project size, which is in a sense negative, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But then this lower project size entails a much lower or a very importantly lower risk, namely variance,
Right.
in which case the utility increases. And so
Mhm.
sometimes it may happen that the situation says, okay, I am risk averse and therefore I prefer to reduce my size because this increases actually my utility
Right.
compared to the other case of agent-based negotiation. So
Yes.
I think there is an interplay between Q and the project size on one side, and then U, the target, as well as a trade-off between expectation and variance. So anyway, I mean, you can look at things from different perspective, right? The operations
Yeah.
perspective is to look at the size,
Yeah.
but then since your objective is a monetary assessment of
Mhm.
of the target,
Yeah.
in that case, you might be willing also to look at that, at these
Yeah.
net revenues or risk-adjusted revenues, I would say.
Yes. Yeah, that's a great suggestion. I think one of my co-authors is also here in the webinar, so we're going to take some notes and
Cameron, okay,
to add
good,
them to the paper. Yes.
excellent,
Okay.
thank you.
So if there are no more other questions, let me quickly wrap up the presentation
Sure.
because the next model extension, I'm not going to talk too much. I'm not going to talk about that, but just to demonstrate that we also consider more than two buyers in this case. And the purpose of doing so is to verify that we obtained consistent result. And of course, we also get a little bit more new insights regarding, for example, the impact of increasing the number of buyers. Interestingly, we found that, okay, if the buyers, if we have many buyers, then the agent buyer actually shows us even stronger preference for joint negotiation. And this may partly explain the phenomenon that we observe in reality that actually many firms, they adopt the consortium-based or so-called joint negotiation instead of the agent-based negotiation. Finally, some concluding remarks. I think if some people ask me, okay, give me 1 minute, what are the main takeaway points? So I think the first thing is we identify the economic interest in this PPA contract are not fully assigned. We have seen that the seller always prefers the buyer to negotiate separately, but the buyers, they often benefit from collaboration. But which collaboration, agent-based or consortium-based or joint negotiation is better, depends on the distribution of the negotiation power between the buyers. Secondly, we found that the REC banking operations can support larger project sizes. I think this is the good news for arguments supporting the REC, having the REC, a very dynamic and active REC market. Also, we found that the buyer's risk aversion can undermine the project size, which reduce the investment scale. And we are also doing some ongoing research because fortunately we can obtain some data from the PJM market, the Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland market in the US. And then we have analyzed the data, and it looks like maybe a better assumption is the electricity market prices are time correlated. And in this case, we can run a more comprehensive numerical study based on this real data. And of course, we welcome any suggestions for future research directions. This concludes the presentation today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shi. There is another question by Metin. Does
Yeah.
this research apply in more general contexts, such as no renewable targets and with PPA contracts only for regular mom for energy, mom renewable energy, actually?
Mm.
Agent-based joint negotiation might have not been studied in regular energy context.
Okay.
It's
Yeah,
in the chat.
that's a very good question.
Non-renewable,
Yeah,
non-renewable.
non-renewable energy.
Yeah.
Yes. So first of all, let me think. I think the base model, right? We have a buyers, a different negotiation mechanism. I think the answer is yes. This model framework can apply to even the purchase of regular energy because, as you can see in the base model, the renewable energy target is taken as exogenous. It doesn't really play a role in that base model. And that part only plays an active role when we consider REC banking, when we consider the more subtle and dynamic strategy, right? If you have a REC, you can sell to the market, you can purchase from the market, and so on. So I think that part is more relevant if we consider the firm's renewable energy trading strategies. But generally speaking, I think yes, the general model framework can apply to even non-renewable energy sectors. Yeah. Okay.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much, Shi.